Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Reem Kassis, discussing her new book, The Arabesque Table, Contemporary Recipes from the Arab World. She is joined tonight in conversation by Nik Sharma. This event is part of our Good Taste series, which highlights exciting new cookbooks, food writing, and work that centers around the role that food plays in our communities and daily lives. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our new digital community during these challenging times. Our spring season is in full swing, so make sure to check out our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to purchase a copy of the Arabesque Table, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you, especially during this difficult time for community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible and, now more than ever, supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now I am so pleased to introduce today's speakers. Reem Kassis is the author of The Palestinian Table, which won the Guild of Food Writers' First Book Award, a Gourmand's World Cook Award, and was a James Beard Award nominee, as well as one of NPR's Best Books of the Year. It's also a Harvard Bookstore perennial bestseller. Reem's other work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, as well as a number of academic journals. She is joined by Nik Sharma. Nik is a molecular biologist turned cookbook author and photographer. Nik is currently a columnist for Serious Eats, Food 52, and The Guardian Feast. He is also a contributor to the New York Times cooking section. His first cookbook season was a James Beard and IACP finalist. His latest book, The Flavor Equation, was recently named the Book of the Year by Delicious UK. Today, they are discussing the Arabesque Table. With her engaging voice, expansive research, and cultural knowledge, Reem offers a contemporary take on an ancient, remarkably diverse cuisine. The Arabesque Table is more than just a collection of Arabic recipes. It is a celebration of the evolution of the Arab cuisine and the stories of cross-cultural connection it recounts, paying tribute to the history and journey that has led it to this point. Yotam Ottolenghi himself says about it, the Arabesque Table is filled to the brim with dishes which are rooted in tradition and at the same time creatively and deliciously transcend it. It is wonderful. And on that note of high praise, I'll turn things over to our authors. Reem, Nik, thank you so much for joining us tonight. The virtual podium is yours. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Thank you, Audrey.
Thanks, Audrey. Hi, Reem.
Hi, Nik.
Congratulations. I'm good. Congratulations on your new beautiful book.
Thank you.
And I think I'm matching the book colors now.
That's true. You did a better job than I did.
Yeah, it isn't exactly the same on the yellow, but I tried to do my best.
I mean, from here it looks, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. This is such a beautiful book. I've already bookmarked so many things in here, not only the recipes, but also just notes on the history, the cultures, and all these little notes that I think I'm going to take back with me in my own work. I've just learned so much from this book. You're an excellent researcher, and I'm sure you've heard about this before, but also an excellent cookbook author. And this book is just phenomenal. You did a lot of research for this book, as I know. We've talked about this separately, and we'll talk about that today. But what was the process like with the Arabesque Table? Because we've been in COVID, and I'm guessing part of COVID was, or rather part of your time spent on working on this book also kind of overlapped with COVID. So how was that? Because you also traveled to Palestine back home to, do some of the work for this book. So how was that process?
So it was interesting because everything kind of just broke out right before the photo shoot started. So I had done the majority of the research prior to COVID, and 2 days before we were set to travel to do the photo shoot, they issued this blanket quarantine and we had to cancel our flights. So for a long time, for about 2 or 3 months, it was, touch and go. Is this book even going to come out in the spring like it's supposed to? Is it going to be pushed another season? And luckily enough, we were able to travel back home eventually. We, had to quarantine for 2 weeks and all kinds of different restrictions, but eventually we managed to get it done there. But it was different from the first one. It was a very skeleton crew. It was literally the photographer, me, and my mother, and no assistants, no prop stylists, nothing at all. So it was just the three of us working, long days. I think we did it over 3 weeks, unlike the first one, which we did in 2 weeks. So for me, it was good. It gave us, a bit of a buffer, but it was unusual. But in hindsight, I mean, it kind of made me appreciate the way life was before.
I mean, you guys did an excellent job because the photographs in the book, the styling, everything it felt, and something I see sometimes with a lot of books that are focused on cultures, that there is a tendency to kind of play with the props to make it feel like it connects to a nostalgic time. But I feel the photos here do such a beautiful job of making it feel connected to the past, but it's still in the present. So you see yourself cooking these things or in your kitchen or on your dining table. And so I think it translates so beautifully. And I think I've said this before, one of my favorite photographs in the book is the cheesecake, which I think is so glisteningly beautiful. And let me see, I've marked it. A lot of the, to make it, it's just so beautiful. And I think there's just like such a simplicity that's elegant throughout this book. So if I might just hire you as my stylist.
Oh God, I mean, I'm not a good stylist. I'm a nightmare in that respect. But a lot of the fabrics you see are actually my grandmother's hand embroidered fabric.
Okay.
So that kind of was the connection to the past, but we also wanted it more bright and colorful. So if you see the backgrounds, we wrote, they were heavy backgrounds. I think they were made out of cement or concrete, depending on which one.
Wow.
And just painted. So you see the bright colors, the food is colorful, but then you kind of have these fabrics that take you a bit back in time.
That's
but
beautiful.
No fake props, if you will.
Yeah. So the cover, do you want to tell us a bit more about the cover? Why did you go with this design?
So interestingly enough, I didn't pick this design at all. One of the things that Phaidon is known for is they're artistic and their aesthetic, basically, with their books. So that was the cover that they sent me. It was this one or an identical one, but with a different color scheme. And I think we ended up going with this one because it's brighter. And as usual, whenever I see my, cookbook cover for the first time, I'm like, oh my God, why does it look like that? And then within a couple of weeks, you're like, this is actually nice. And then it comes out and you're like, oh, wow, it stands out. And you kind of start to see the thought process behind why they pick the covers that they pick. And I guess there's a reason they're recognized for the beauty appeal of their books, why they're like coffee table style cookbooks.
I think it's definitely very inviting. It makes you want to open the book. And I think with a lot of cookbooks, that's the first step, as a reader, you want to get to that stage where you'll open the book, and it really does that. I think it's very beautiful. It also feels very modern, but again, it also connects to the culture and the past and ties everything together beautifully. Speaking of culture, and this book has got a lot to do with that, there's so many misconceptions about cultures across the world. I'm from India originally, and there are misconceptions about Indian food and culture. And it goes vice versa too, where there are misconceptions also in India about what the West is. Like I talked to my mom who lives in India, and she'll say things that I have just never heard about. So it goes both ways. Were there some notions that you wanted to, or rather some ideas that you wanted to dispel when working on this book?
Yeah, there were quite a few of them. One of the first ones was this idea of national cuisine, right? I wrote a cookbook that is technically a national cuisine of Palestinian food, but I've also come to realize that national foods are a relatively recent construct in the sense that nation states are new. They only came about in the 19th or late 18th century. So if you look at the foods that we eat today and you look at what the same area and the same people ate 200 years ago, it looks drastically different. So a simple example I always give is tomatoes. You know, tomatoes did not make their way to our part of the world until the 19th century. Same to Italy. They didn't come there till the 18th century. So think of all the dishes we think of as Italian or Arab and how heavily tomato-based they are. And yet 200 years ago, they looked entirely different.
Yeah.
So that was something that I wanted to get across, more so to show how food has been evolving since the start of civilization. You know, food is not stagnant, it changes. And that's, I think, something that's beautiful, something to be celebrated. The problem you have today is that nobody takes the effort, or let's not say, but a lot of people just don't spend the time and effort into getting to know that past and that history. And that's when a lot of things get lost, and you start to see this contention over, are you respecting this nation's cuisine or that nation's cuisine? And it's, even those nations' cuisines have evolved and changed, but you really have to understand the past that got you to that point. So those are the two things I wanted to come across, but primarily also the idea that those things are not mutually exclusive. So you can have a national cuisine and you can use food as a way to develop and hold on to a national identity, which I'm sure for you, your Indian identity is important, same way my Palestinian one is. But that doesn't detract from the fact that our food has evolved throughout time and that we can recognize and celebrate that.
I think that's really important because that's one of the lines that I actually underlined and, you know, marked in your book. And I said, this is something that I need to quote her on later on in life, because it's such an important thing, because these days with this national identity of food, rather nationalism, it's become, especially with food, because it's in such a public sphere and it's so popular right now. I feel there are tighter boundaries being, you know, created around food, which is kind of a construct that will, I feel, just will not last anyway, because even like 100 years from now, it's not going to be what you and I are cooking now. It's going to change again. And so I think the notion that food is, like you said, it's not stagnant, has to evolve over time, is so important. And you're right. I mean, like so many ingredients, like in your book, you've got chilies, you've got tomatoes, potatoes, all of these things that come from the New World. And and now they're like parts of our cultures and cuisines. And people, and like my parents also, like I'll have arguments with them and I'll say, you know, tomatoes never came from India, so you can't really say
neither
this.
Did chilies, and look at how heavily they feature.
So I think that's such an important thing. And it's also, I think, a beautiful way to acknowledge the past and the history, because in the Arab world, there's been a strong history of trade with Asia, with the West as well, and it's been at the center. And so you know, that, you know, like moving back even further, you talk about two cookbooks, the kitabs that are from medieval Arabic history, which are some of the, I think, the earliest or maybe the first known cookbooks in the world, right?
There's one 4th century Roman one, but those are,
Okay. And I think they've definitely influenced your work in this book. Do you want to tell us how they did that, and also any interesting things about those books that you couldn't put into the Arabesque Table?
Yeah, I mean, there was so much in there that I wanted to put in the book, but 250 pages, you know how that goes. So I started looking into these cookbooks initially more just to understand, like, what did food look like back then, what ingredients were used, but very different from the way cookbooks are written today. They were not written as manuals for home cooks or the average person. They were geared more towards the royal or upper echelons of society. And they were basically also written for their medicinal information. So, you know, you would hear this particular ingredient is good for bile, and this one is good for your lungs, and don't eat this if you're feeling hot, but eat this if you're feeling cold. And it was a way also to instruct the different cooks that were coming into the royal courts about how to make certain dishes. And it comes across also in the kinds of dishes that you see. You know, there's a lot of ingredients that would have been very expensive for the average person to procure. They're also written very differently. You know, you and I, our cookbooks have like a list of ingredients and a methodology. There, you literally have 2 sentences for a full entire recipe, which includes the ingredients. I mean, they know exactly how to be economical when it comes to words. But the really fascinating stuff was just realizing how much of the food that we enjoy across the world, in Western Europe in particular, has been influenced by Arab cuisine. Because you start to, you know, a lot of, and I didn't know any of this until I started doing this research, but many things like starch thickened milk puddings. So think panna cotta, blancmange, all those desserts, they were brought to Europe in the Middle Ages by the Arabs. In Spain, the almonds didn't exist until the Moors came in there as well. The idea of deep frying, and look at how many tapas are deep fried, brought in by the Arabs. And then obviously the one that I wrote about was the bagel, which I found a reference to it in the 13th century book, in which, you know, I'm looking through the bread chapter and there's a section on ka'ik, and it's ka'ik is this ring-shaped cookie or dough in Arab cuisine, and it says, you know, they're so well known, we don't need to describe how to make them, but here's a section about the special kinds. And one of them literally says, put this ring-shaped dough on a dowel, boil it in water, and then bake it. And that's essentially what bagels are today. And if you trace it, you start to see how, you know, the Arabs took over Bari in Italy. It was their primary stronghold in the Middle Ages. This woman from Bari went to Poland. She married into the royal family. The royal family started making these ring-shaped breads called obwarznik. And then from there, the Jews started making it in 16th century to bypass these laws that they couldn't bake bread. They had to boil it first. And now you come to America and you have bagels. And you know,
it's so phenomenal the way like food moves. I mean, Arab food has also influenced a lot of Indian food, and a lot of the words are also the same. Like naan comes from Iran, from naan, and you know, like naan, and then even pulav and pulao, they all go by similar.
Samosa and sambusik as well.
Yeah, paneer and then cheese. I mean, paneer and paneer, right? PNIR, and then obviously the English spellings. But I think that's just so remarkable that everything is just connected in a certain way. And one of the things with recipes is that recipes are always, and historically, they're always born out of a necessity and adaptation to where you're living, what ingredients you have. So are there some recipes in this book where you feel this becomes much more obvious than others? And also in your own life, when you cook at home with your family, in what ways have your recipes evolved compared to what you grew up or, you know, cooking and eating in Palestine?
So some of the recipes, you know, they're different because I was trying to experiment and be creative and whatnot. But a lot of them really, like you were saying, were born out of necessity. For example, the stuffed cabbage pie was simply me being lazy. I don't want to roll every single leaf by itself. So I'm like, let me dump it all in a, you know, in a tray and see how it works out. And it came out as surprising. I don't like stuffed cabbage, but that particular dish I absolutely love. It's just when you bake it in the oven versus stovetop, it's a totally different flavor profile. There's another one, a Swiss chard stew, which with like frigola sarda in the book is what I use, this Italian small pasta similar to couscous. But back home, we make it with this plant called khubeze, which is a kind of mallow that's close to impossible to find here in the US, or you have to go to very specific Arab grocers. So I use Swiss chard instead. You know, it's not the plant that you're supposed to use, but the flavorings, the fried onions and the chili and whatnot, that's what really gives it its flavor. So off the top of my head, those are two that show how you kind of have to adjust and adapt to what you have.
Yeah, I think that's something, again, that ties back to the whole like national identity thing where things can evolve and you can still stay true to your culture.
I think the difference now, Nik, though, is oh, sorry, I was just going to say things are happening so much faster now, right? Like before, they used to evolve over decades and centuries. It would take occupations and empires and war and migration and trade. Today, it's literally all it takes is your laptop.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that's changed a lot of the food scene right now is social media and video being much more accessible, you know, on your phone versus you don't have to go and watch a TV show. You could just get it on your phone or you know, platforms like YouTube. So you see a lot of food that's being cooked also, not only here in the West, but also in countries outside. Like I watch a Turkish channel on YouTube. I think it's called a channel, quite sure. But this lady named Rafika, she cooks Turkish food and she's always innovating within Turkish food. And it's so amazing, like the stuff that she does. And I say, okay, this is actually a brilliant idea. Why haven't I thought about it? So there's just like so much information coming at us right now. And I think you're definitely right that it's evolving at a much faster pace than it did before. Talking about similarities and differences, one of the recipes in your book that struck a note with me was the fish. and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, is the naye, because it reminded me of
Oh.
ceviche and poke. And poke is very popular. I live in LA, and poke is really popular everywhere.
Yeah.
Hawaii, you get poke. You also get, I mean, and obviously with ceviches, I feel all over the country now, it's really popular. So I thought that was really interesting, where raw fish was is like, and you use that multiple times in your book also in different dishes. I thought it was really beautiful to see that that theme of using an acid to, and this is where the science comes in, which I find also very exciting, is where an acid is used to cure the meat, but it also makes it safer to consume and adds flavor at the same time. And do you know much about the history of this, how this has moved across the world?
So the exact trajectory, no, but what I do know is the very word ceviche is a derivative of the Persian words for dishes called sikbaj, which were vinegar marinated dishes. And then they used to marinate meats and fishes with it and whatnot. And that's where the word supposedly comes from. But it's also interesting to see that raw fish, if you look in the Arab world and the larger Middle East, you generally find it only, I mean, people don't eat it as much, but if you do find it, it's on the coastal areas. And that speaks to also the regionality of food, right? I mean, you see this everywhere. So India is a great example of this. The food of the South, it could be a different country from the food of the North almost at times. Or the coast, in Goa, it's going to be entirely different from the landlocked areas of the country. So the raw fish is probably not a very common dish to find in the Arab world. We're primarily desert, but if you do go to the coastal areas, that's where you would find more fish.
Okay. One of the things speaking of India, one of the things you do in this book, and I've never seen anyone talk about it, my bad if I haven't, so I apologize early on to all those authors you did, but you are the first author that I've seen that talks about amba and actually connects it to India. And I've seen amba mentioned in a lot of books, from Middle Eastern to Israeli food. And I'd always sounded familiar to me because mango, and that's what amba uses, is mango. And I never knew personally, I did not know the connection, but the name just sounded familiar to me. And I thought, oh, must be something through trade that has migrated, across the world, or rather to that part of the world. And in India, I grew up in Bombay, and that's it's the capital of Maharashtra, where you mentioned that amba comes from, that word. And I said, wow, okay, now someone has actually written about this, and I feel, okay, I'm not crazy for thinking
You're not crazy,
yeah. So I thought this is really cool that you've taken the time, you've done the work, and you're telling people these are the connections of how things move. Were there any other instances where you see, and we talked a little bit about this earlier about words moving. Were there any other things where you saw certain perhaps flavor profiles or combinations that are repetitive and that come to Arab cuisine from different parts of the world?
So there's a lot of ingredients that we use that are not native. I mean, even lemons come from India. Eggplants probably come from India. Rice is also an ingredient, which when you think of Arab cuisine, you're like, oh, rice. We were talking about pilafs before, but rice is native to Asia. It only, it did not come to our part of the world until a few centuries ago. And even when it did, it was reserved for the very wealthy. It was expensive to get. Yeah. So, I mean, even in my grandfather's time, they weren't eating rice. They were eating bulgur. They were eating frika, all these grains that come out of, or the wheats ensuing products, because it was cheaper. That's why also they ate whole wheat bread, not white bread, simply because it was cheaper to do that. So it's mostly ingredients more than anything that I see migrating from one place to the next. But you also see ingredients themselves changing over time. So eggplant, for example, it used to be, they used to say it has the color of a scorpion's abdomen and it tastes like its sting. So basically not something that, makes it appetizing or that you want to eat. It was considered bitter, and they thought it made you go mad and all these things. And then you look at our cuisine today and you're like, are you serious? Like, look at how many different uses we have for eggplant, how many dishes, cooked, salads, dips. I mean, it's endless, right? And the history would, the story goes that, and again, this is documented, but go figure, who knows, that there was a woman called Buran who married a caliph in the area of present day Iraq in Mesopotamia, and it was considered one of the most lavish feasts ever witnessed. And she made a dish of eggplants, which in today's world would be super simple. It was nothing but fried eggplant, but she had salted it before, and that removed the bitterness. So suddenly people were like, oh my God, eggplant is good. And actually eggplant dishes in the Arab world are often called buraniyat, which means, dishes of Buran. And that was the name of that lady. So sometimes it's also, realizing how to treat a certain ingredient as well that makes it sway, into a cuisine, whereas before it wasn't used at all.
Fascinating. So speaking of ingredients, tahini, and I got to ask you because this has always boggled me. Well, not boggled, but I don't know if I should ever use it. Black tahini and white tahini. Is black tahini really popular in the Arab world? Or is it just a thing that's sold here? Because I've wanted to use it, but I don't know if it's worth, should I just stick with white tahini or
it looks different. It looks different. It tastes different. It's more nutty. And I think it has its uses, but it's not used in the Arab world. And the thing with tahini, the flavor of it, people tell you, oh, the terroir really matters. If it's the seeds from Ethiopia, it really matters. What really matters is how you treat the seeds more than anything.
Okay.
It's how much they're roasted, whether they're hulled or not, how they're ground, what mechanisms, how fresh it is. Those are the things that really impact the flavor. In terms of black, I personally don't use it much. And if I do, it would probably be more in desserts than anything. Mm-hmm. Just because if you're making hummus and you serve someone black hummus, it's not going to fly over well in the Arab world.
I've seen a black hummus which has
there's so much that has been done to hummus that's
so bizarre.
Sacrilege to not be done. But yeah, I mean
there's a thing today, and you're probably going to get so annoyed that I bring this up, but I saw something about a hummus smoothie today.
How much more can they do to this poor thing? But yeah.
So yeah, I mean, hummus is very popular. So there you go.
I just find, since we're on the topic, I'm going to bring this up, but it's so funny when people call beetroot hummus or this hummus, you know what the word means? It means chickpea. Mm-hmm. And so when we say hummus, we're generally referring to those chickpeas, and the dish of it mixed with tahini and mashed into a paste, we call as hummus. But like anything else that has tahini in it but does not have the actual chickpeas is called mutabbal, which means just seasoned or spiced.
Okay.
So I'm always like laughing when you go to restaurants and you see these menus and it's like, I don't know, fava bean and carrot hummus. I'm like, where are the chickpeas? There's no chickpeas. Then why is it hummus,
I think it's just got so much attention and popularity over the past maybe 10 years that it's one of those things that people just want to put into everything and just have that word in there to sell it. And tahini is also going in that direction. I feel sometimes it has to be in everything.
It is, and desserts and savory applications. I don't see it as much in the West. I don't know if you. I mean, they use it.
I've used it in sweets. Yeah, I've used it mostly in sweets. But I actually haven't. I haven't actually. Yeah, you do a tahini recipe in your book for the cheesecake, but you also use it in the sticky pudding, the sticky toffee pudding. And when you're constructing, and we're talking about desserts with tahini, which leads me to this question. Chapter. Right? How does that work? If you were giving tips to people who want to use tahini more in different ways, what would be maybe 3 points that you would give them how to use it in their kitchens? Because I feel it's becoming such an important pantry staple everywhere in the country. I think people who are listening today would probably be interested.
So I'm going to tell it, from a food perspective. You're the scientist. So if I'm saying something that's totally wrong in terms of chemicals and baking, please stop me. But I think tahini is, if you think about it, essentially it's like peanut or almond butter. What is it? It's just the sesame seeds that have been processed. It happens to be a little bit more liquid in form than solid. So if you think about it, you can replace any recipe that has peanut butter or almond butter or pistachio or sunflower butter with tahini. But, and this is where the science part comes in that I don't know about, you would probably have to adjust for the liquid in it slightly, just because it tends to be runnier than those pastes. And I would think of it almost like the savory element of your dish, right? Like the thing that messes with your brain and keeps you coming back for more with desserts oftentimes is that contrast of sweet and salty. And tahini kind of amps that up, because it does have some savoriness to it. So for example, the reason I even thought of putting it in a cheesecake was, to me, those desserts were always so cloyingly sweet that it was too much, right? Like I couldn't finish a piece of cheesecake. And I thought, well, this is similar to the way you might use miso and caramel. And if you use tahini in that, you're kind of serving a similar purpose of making it more savory. So yeah, replace the, nut butters. It can work in their place if you want to add a savory element to dishes. And then the last one, probably just eat it by itself. Mix it with so mix it with honey, mix it with grape molasses, date molasses. It's, in my first book, I said it's the equivalent of the Arab world's peanut butter and jelly, but it's a lot healthier. I also, you can mix it into oatmeal. You can mix it into, it's versatile, I think. And that was what I wanted the chapter to convey. Like, here are some ideas, but you can explore along these same dimensions if you want.
I laughed a lot when I read one of the headnotes in your recipes, and this was about your parents' kitchen.
Oh God, the factory, right?
Yeah, it reminded me of my dad. My dad went through a phase when I was a kid, and I remember him taking over the one kitchen window they had in their apartment, and he filled it with jars of pickles. And I don't know who ate them all, because he just kept making pickles and all sorts of sizes. And it was crazy. And I think where you described it reminded me of that it was basically like a fermentation factory. What is your parents' pantry like? And I have like a little bit of a sense, not only from the book, but also because you sent me za'atar and dukkha, which I love, and I use it very sparingly.
Dude, just use it. I'll send you more. I got a fresh batch.
Okay. But tell me more, like, what their kitchen pantry is, because I feel that's a place I could get lost in. I'm sure many people would love knowing more about.
Oh, the smell of it, and I talk about this in the intro to the book, is so different to the smell of my pantry. Like, it smells like za'atar and olives and olive oil, and coffee, because they buy their coffee in batches. But basically what my parents do, and this is something that everyone has done historically in the Arab world, is you preserve what's in season to last you throughout the year. So in the spring, they will go and they will pick za'atar from the mountains and they will dry it. And then my mother will have these giant cloth bags of dried za'atar leaves. And so what I sent you is basically that has been ground and mixed with sumac and sesame seeds and salt. So that lasts throughout the year. They also, in the fall, they will pick their own olive groves, and then it will be pickled in different ways. You have it green, you have it black, you have it salted, you have it pickled. So those staples are always there. And then there's the different grains. There's frike, which is the smoky green wheat. There's maftul. Obviously, the other staples like flour and whatnot, and olive oil. There's a lot of that. And then there's spices. I sometimes feel like I'm going to Aladdin's cave, or it's not jewels, though, it's spices. It'd be interesting. Yeah. Although I say that, but spices wars were waged over spices. They were at one point more valuable than jewels. So I joke, but it's not really a joke.
It's true. It's very true. People have fought over what is that, tulips to spices.
Yeah, and poppies and all of it.
Yeah. One of the ingredients you talk about in this book, and it's one of my personal favorite ingredients in the world, is nigella seeds. And I really appreciate the fact that you hone it down, hammer this message again, that it is not onion seed, it is not black cumin. And I think nigella is great on bread, but generally in savory preparations. And it's also, and I know that's one of the ways it's used in the Middle East too. Are there any other instances where perhaps nigella is used that we couldn't, or probably I'm not thinking of?
There's actually, there is. There's a Palestinian dessert, and it's very much, I think, a love it or hate it flavor. You've had the nigella seed, so you know how strong of a taste it has, where it's ground the way you would grind tahini. So it becomes like a black tahini, but it's, again, not black sesame seeds, it's nigella seeds. And it's mixed with semolina and flour and, and baked as a cake in the oven and then soaked in syrup. And it's it's super dark black cake, which, when you think about it, it's interesting, but the flavor, I personally really like it. I didn't put it in either book because it was just, I thought it would be something that's not going to appeal to the masses. One thing about nigella seed, they say that apparently the Prophet Muhammad used to say that it cures everything except death. So
Okay.
basically, it's like a super healthy seed to enjoy. And one thing that they do is, and I remember my father, when I was younger, he did this for a while. They would grind it with honey and put it in a jar,
Okay.
and every morning have a spoon of it. So that was like
Oh,
your
wow.
vitamin for the day. It wasn't disgusting, but it was strong. I mean, it burns your throat when it slides down.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
but
Fascinating. I've never tried that. I
supposedly it's
might actually do
healthy.
the honey thing. I
Oh
might
my
start
God.
with the honey thing.
Put a lot of honey though, Nick.
Okay, it's that strong.
It's very strong.
Okay.
Especially once you grind it, because the oils come out and you know, becomes
One of
more
the things,
pungent.
yeah. So one of the things in relation to the pantry conversation that we're having about was fermentation, and you have a lot of recipes in your book. You've got a recipe for chilies that are fermented with walnuts. And can you talk a little bit about how fermentation, and you've also got yogurt in the book. You've got yogurt in one of the chapters in the book. Can you talk a little bit about how fermentation is perceived in the Arab world, and the necessity behind some of these practices, obviously preservation and stuff. So yeah, can you talk more about that?
So like we were talking about necessity before, fermentation for all cultures across the globe came out of necessity, right? You want to find a way to preserve the excess bounty you have in the summer for the next season, and salt is a natural preservative. So a lot of our ferments are basically cured in salt and a solution of salt and water, and that should preserve them from one season to the next. But the one you're specifically referring to is fermented in olive oil. So olive oil is another form of preservation. So oftentimes, even if like things like labane or chili shatta, the chili paste, you will cover the jar with olive oil, and this way you kind of guarantee that it's not going to rot, it's not going to mold until you open it and start using it. And there actually are quite a few things that get preserved in olive oil in the Arab world.
Okay.
Most famously is the baby eggplants. And those baby eggplants are stuffed with chilies, garlic, and walnuts, which was the inspiration for that recipe you referenced. It's basically my favorite part of the whole dish. And since it's difficult to find those baby eggplants, and it's so finicky to find the right type and boil it just to the right degree and slice it and fill it, so I just put a recipe for basically the filling.
In terms of the fermentation, one of the things that was new to me was you talk about putting the olive oil jar, the pickles with the olive oil directly in sunlight. That was something that was new to me, and so I haven't done that, and so that's one of the recipes that I bookmarked that I really want to try it, because it's I'm sure it gives a different taste. With preserved lemons, which is probably one of the most popular lacto fermented foods that I think pretty much I hope everyone knows about. Preserved lemons are made with salt. So do you, and this is probably a very California question to ask, but do you preserve your own lemons?
I do. I have 2 jars right there. One from 2 months ago and one from 1 month ago. And it's so easy to do that sometimes I'm like, why? And I know what's going into it as opposed to buying it from the store. But one thing that's also two things. One is, once you've preserved your lemons, what I often do is after a month or so, I will take them out of the jar. It's the skin that's mostly usable. So I'll take out all the skin, discard the pith and the liquid and whatnot, and I will grind it. And then I'll preserve it in ice cube trays in the freezer. Okay. And then every time you want to add it to a dish, you literally pop out 1 or 2 ice cubes and just throw it in, and you're good to go. The other thing is, there is a way to do it very fast, right? If you don't want to wait for 1 month, you can actually slice the lemons and put them in salt in a Ziploc bag that you suck the air out of. So you vacuum seal it. You put it in the freezer 24 hours, you take it out, you let it defrost, you repeat the process, I think 2 or 3 times. And then you have basically preserved lemon in the span of like 3 or 4 days.
Interesting. Is the liquid reusable? Because I've seen a lot of people say that the fermented liquid from the preserved lemons can be used to make a fresh batch. Is that true?
I don't see why it wouldn't be. I've never done it, but I mean, if you're actually specific, especially if you're squeezing lemon juice to make the liquid, not water, then it almost feels like a waste not to reuse it.
Yeah. With ingredients, so most of the ingredients in your book are easily available everywhere. But are there any specific stores in the country that you want to give a shout out to and tell people where they could go and get these ingredients to cook the recipes from your book?
So I mix and match where I buy, and I do most of my grocery shopping online right now. Kalustian's is probably sells one of the widest range of spices and ingredients from all over the world, not just the Arab world. It's a shop in New York. I don't like to use Amazon, but sometimes I do, just because there are certain ingredients that I only find there. And then otherwise, if you're looking for spices, I think it's worth it to dig a little bit to see who is selling like single origin spices. You know, you don't have to buy everything in bulk from the same place. So like find that one supplier that sells allspice that's coming straight from Jamaica, that one that's doing cinnamon that's coming from Sri Lanka, that one that's, or you know, if you're doing cassia that's coming from Vietnam or whatnot, or black pepper from India, and so on and so forth. So it's worth it to do a little bit of extra research. I mean, don't go down rabbit holes like I do, but just, I don't like to buy ground spices at all.
Yeah.
I also don't like to buy like whole spices from Whole Foods, because they sell you a jar this big for God knows how much, when you can actually buy the same quality bag from somewhere else.
So my last question for today is going to be at one of my favorite desserts that I had. I tasted for the first time in Dubai, and that's Umali, the bread pudding.
Oh yeah.
Which is, I think, one of the most comforting desserts I've ever eaten. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's just such a simple dish to make, but it's also very elegant the way it's presented. I mean, and it's such a great use of food.
You can't go wrong. It's essentially a bread pudding minus the eggy custard, which it's probably the part of bread pudding that I don't like. And Umali is essentially croissants or puff pastry that have been soaked in milk and baked in the oven, and they have a lot of nuts and coconuts and dry. I mean, it's at your discretion what you use.
Okay.
So in the book, the version I put, I believe it has halawa, which is, or halva, and dates and pistachios, and I think it's flavored with cardamom, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a slightly different profile from the traditional one, but it's one of the easiest desserts to make. You literally, like, you have old croissants, you have old puff pastry, you just toss it up, rip it up, put the milk and cream on it, and put it in and sugar, and put it in the oven, and you're good to go. You don't even need to do all the flavorings I've done. It is very,
I mean, it is just so beautiful, and it's like you said, it's just so simple. It's one of the only thing, I've been to Dubai once, and that's the only dish I remember that it's made such an impression in my head. So that's all that I have for today. If people have questions.
I think there's some in the Q&A.
All right, so we have a question here from Nadia. Can you talk about the influence of the spice trade and Silk Road on Arab cuisine?
So Arab traders traded all along the Silk Route. So for example, that story I was telling you about the bagel. What's interesting is if you go to Western China, you will see that there is a place there that has a bread called gerdanan, which looks exactly like the bagel. And what is common there is it was exactly along the Silk Route. That's where the Arab traders were trading. It's also all the stories that we know of Sinbad and the Seven Seas, and a lot of these fairy tales, if you will, and these stories about monsters were actually told by Arab merchants as a way to prevent people from trying to go and trade along these routes and take over their monopoly. So it's, you know, you don't think of a lot of these cultural artifacts that have made their way into our lives that were as a result of these trade routes. And, you know, so small example, but
Sarah has a question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the evolution of recipes as they are passed down and changed due to migration.
I mean, I see this personally firsthand from my own cooking. You know, I'm here in the US, and a lot of the dishes, you know, we spoke about that specific stew, the Swiss chard stew, where you don't have a certain ingredient. And I think what ends up happening is over time, like a recipe doesn't change from 0 to 180 degrees in the span of one generation. But throughout the course of time and people moving from one place to the next, ingredients start to change. And then you start to have also over time, like more conveniences. So it's very different if you're baking bread in a convection oven at home versus you're baking it on stone outside in the ground. So you start to see these small shifts throughout time. And that's the case in point for why I think it's important to highlight and recognize the history, because eventually it will get lost if we don't, because these changes happen so slowly that you don't recognize them while they're happening.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that's the hardest when you're, working on a recipe and developing, especially for a cookbook or a story you're writing, is where does one go then as a writer to look for this information? And often it's a struggle.
It's a struggle. And I think right now, I would say, Nik, like the onus is on us to be the ones who are preserving what it's like to eat today. Because 100 years from now, if someone's looking back, they should have these texts that kind of explain what it's like to eat today and what was happening in our time.
And I think that's why this book is going to be so useful to people who cook, but also people who don't cook and want to learn just more about Arab cuisine and the people. I think this is just going to be such a useful book. Felix has a question for you. I always thought the Arab cuisine was most influenced by the Ottoman Empire. Is that the case?
It's the opposite. So it's funny because people always say that. They're like, oh, Ottoman cuisine influenced Arab cuisine. It's literally the entire opposite story. So the first Ottoman cookbook, do you know what it is? It's a translation of the 10th century Arabic cookbook, Kitab al-Tabikh. So it was the Sultan's court physician who took Kitab al-Tabikh, translated it from Arabic into Turkish, and then added several recipes, and it became the first Ottoman cookbook. And the Ottomans had actually, they weren't all Turks or Ottomans at the time. A lot of them were crusaders who had come from all over the Arab and Persian empires, and they had built their own, empire by the time they were a power in our region. But their cuisine absolutely was, it was Arab cuisine that influenced theirs. What actually ended up happening later is a lot of those dishes, because, our time frame goes back to the Ottoman Empire. We don't go further back than that. So there are things, for example, in Arab cuisine, you see a lot of the recipes in these books call for stuffing lambs and stuffing chickens and animals, like very celebratory dishes. When the Ottomans started doing that stuff, they started stuffing more vegetables. I don't know whether for economic reasons or whatnot. And it kind of made those a little bit more popular, perhaps. And it started traveling. So it is a symbiotic relationship depending on what point in time you look at. But it's, one point that I've made sure to get across whenever I get asked is their first cookbook was Arabic food. So anything that they've derived since then was originally from that Arabic cookbook.
This is a question, and I'm glad someone asked this because I actually didn't think about this, but tea. Tea has such a rich history. Do you have any thoughts on tea in Arabic cuisine? Do you use tea at all?
Yeah, tea is it's the drink of choice. Like Arabs drink black coffee with cardamom, and they drink black tea with mint in the summer or with sage in the winter. And we don't grow tea, so I imagine it must have made its way from India and China, probably in reference to that first question via the trade routes. But it's definitely, a very popular drink. But we don't drink green tea. We only drink black tea. We don't use it in cooking. We only use it for drinking. So.
What about date seed coffee? I know some countries in the Middle East will roast date seeds to make a coffee. Is that something that you've tasted or tried before?
No, it's probably more common in the Gulf. I haven't personally tried it. This is probably like maybe the first or second time I've heard of it. But the Gulf is where palm trees are, they grow there. It's, if you go back in history and look at during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, they used to say when he would break his fast, it would be on dates and camel milk. So literally it was their staple cuisine, their staple food. So I'm not surprised that they would roast the seeds and do something.
I've always wanted to try it, but never had a chance to.
Yeah.
Maybe we should.
I have some date seeds now. I'm like, oh, should I roast them and grind them?
I keep saving like a little Ziploc bag. Maybe I'll have enough to do it because you can't do it for 4 or 5 seeds.
Well, if you do it, let me know what it's like.
Okay, I will. Here's another question about the Ottoman Empire. Can you talk a little? It's related to what you spoke about, but can you talk about the evolution of Arab cuisine during the Ottoman Empire?
So I think I mentioned a little bit is a lot of the vegetable, for example, stuffed vegetables, they became more mainstream in Arab cuisine after the Ottoman Empire. Whereas like we would mostly stuff occasion meals, like we were saying lambs, chickens, things that are big. And there they made it something that was more of a day-to-day type of meal. So now Arab families on a weekly basis will stuff kusa, courgettes, squash, grape leaves, etc. So you see that. And then again, it's funny because there are dishes that have been lost in Arab cuisine. So we say Mahalabia, which is that thickened milk pudding, but Mahalabia in old Arab cookbooks was actually, it was a thickened milk pudding, but it was layers of bread and chicken and then the milk pudding and the nuts and the seed. It wasn't just the milk pudding. And it was called Mahalabia based on a leader called Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra, and it was his favorite dish, and very creatively, Arabs name a lot of their dishes based on who loved them the most. But if you go to Turkey today, they actually still have that dish. So it's funny because that dish they acquired from the Arabs, but now the Arabs no longer use it, whereas the Turks still do. So it's so funny to see like who holds on to which parts of a culinary history.
Gosh, that's so fascinating. So this is related to food. Do you read any food fiction? Do you have any favorites?
I was just talking to my mother about this morning. I don't read food fiction per se, but I read a lot of literary fiction, and rare is the book that I read that doesn't have food in it. And it's not a book about food, but when you're describing day-to-day life, when you're describing emotions, when you're describing experiences, food is a big part of that, because food is also, it's the smells, it's the environment around eating. It describes what your day-to-day life is like and your experience at home. So a lot of the books that I read have food in them. If you want my favorites, I'm reading, pachinko. I love in general, like Korean TV shows, Korean stories, food, etc. So pachinko was one where there was food in that story. The book I'm reading right now is Vietnamese, and I think it's called Where the Mountain Sings. I'm just looking up the name right now. I read everything on my Kindle now, but yeah, I think it's called Where the Mountain Sings, and they discuss a lot of the different, the mountains sing. Sorry, it's called The Mountains Sing, and there's a lot of reference to Vietnamese dishes in there.
I think for me, that's what draws me to a TV show or a book, or when it's not related to food, is the food. I mean, you see them eating food, and you kind of it's like a window into their lives.
You watch TV, Turkish TV shows.
I watch Turkish TV, and I got drawn into it because there was this one episode where, or maybe like 10 episodes in this show, was all about this hot pepper paste and people eating bread with it. And it was literally like everyone and all the characters would talk about it, and I got drawn into it. Asked a Turkish friend of mine who then told me what to buy, and I made it at home.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah. So here's a question for both of us. And do either of you have particular comfort foods you gravitate towards? Go ahead.
Oh, God. So there are foods that remind me of my childhood, which like the stuffed courgettes, the stuffed grape leaves, which I make at home on a regular basis. But there are other, I guess you could call them comfort foods that I don't like to make because they remind me so much of home. I only like it when my mother makes it or my grandmother makes it, stuffed chicken or whatnot. But on a day-to-day basis, honestly, for me, just like chicken broth with, I often just tear like bread in it, khubez, pita bread, and I find it so simple and so satisfying. And, if I'm being adventurous, I'll put noodles and fish sauce and lime and the whole shebang.
Mine is ice cream and rice. Anything with rice and ice cream are my two go-tos.
Together too?
I've done toasted rice ice cream. So I guess that's
really?
That's actually really good. Yeah, if the rice is fragrant, it works really well. Here's a question about your kids and their foods. What are your kids' favorite foods?
So my oldest favorite food is sushi.
Pizza?
So it's so crazy because I'm talking about my 7-year-old who is a very picky eater, and she will eat pretty much nothing, but she loves sushi, she loves bacon, and she loves sardines and smoked salmon. And I'm like, you have the weirdest palate I've ever come across. Like, what? My younger one has a palate more like mine. She loves, stuffed vegetables and meat and rice and the usual stuff.
Wow. Here's a question. You spoke about how some foods we associate with certain cultures are actually recent additions, like tomatoes, that they were brought from somewhere else. Why do you think these foods sometimes lose their original association and the average person doesn't know where they originated?
So I don't think that like tomatoes lose their association with where they came from. It's just certain cultures like Italy start to become the ones that are associated with tomatoes because the dishes that they make rely on them heavily. It's no one sits there and thinks, oh, I wonder where tomatoes come from. People think, oh, I wonder where like spaghetti bolognese, or which many will argue should not have tomato in it, or like where pizza and lasagna come from. So and it's not that people forget, it's that people sometimes just don't bother to do the research or to look. And again, if you're not into the food world, like, why would you? You know, it's, I'm not,
yeah, I think we take these things much more personally than other people.
probably.
Can you talk a little bit about mahaleb and mastic in Arab cuisine?
Sure. So mastic, I'll do first. It's easier. It's just the resin of a gum tree, and it's used to flavor desserts, milk puddings often, but it's also used if you're boiling meat, if you're frying meat, it helps remove the certain meaty stench that sometimes comes out. So you'll crush it in between 2 spoons with some salt or with a pestle and mortar, and it helps. Mahlab is the one that I find more interesting. So there's a certain cherry, and that has a seed in it, and inside that seed, if you crack it open, is that little I guess a pit of inside the seed, and that's what mahlab is. And it's used to flavor breads. It's used to flavor cakes, the holiday date cakes. It's also a primary flavor in Arabic white cheese.
Okay, and both of them, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think both of them are used also to make ice cream in
and
Iran.
Mastic is, and it's what makes it stretchy. So mastic, if you chew it, you can chew it like gum.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay. I actually have some and I've never used it.
Yeah, I mean, I use it mostly if I'm like boiling meats or chicken or that kind of thing, or if I want to flavor it Mahalabia, milk pudding. Mahlab, I've never had ice cream with mahlab, but it's a strong flavor. I mean,
I think I saw it in and I can't remember the author, but she's written several cookbooks on Persian cuisine, on Iranian food.
That's interesting.
And it's in one of her books, and I think it's like you said, it's the stretchy ice cream, but it's put between 2 pieces of a white kind of sandwich. It's not and it has saffron and rose water.
Oh wow, that's nice.
But I think those are all the questions for today, and I love talking with you as always. I know we can chat for hours. Thank you for having me do this today. It's been such a privilege and
for me too, Nik. Yeah, it's been long overdue, so I'm glad we had the chance to do it. Thank you.
Thank you both for being here. This has been such a wonderful talk, and I love food history, so this is really lovely for me personally. Thank you, Reem and Nik, for taking the time and coming and giving this beautiful talk. And thank you to everyone here at home who's showing up for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and our incredible staff at Harvard Bookstore. If you would like to support Reem and the Harvard Bookstore, check out the link in the chat where you can purchase a copy of the Arabesque Table. Please remember to shop indie, shop local. From all of us at Harvard Bookstore, have a great night. Be well, be safe. Take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye.